Hello, everyone. On this podcast episode, I'm going to try to explain existence and non-existence again. You know, I've explained it many times in my podcast episodes, but I feel like I just need to go over it, one more time. So, in this world, this is a world of duality. And because this is a world of duality, it is also a world of relativity, as in, you can only exist relative to something, you know. So this is an example of duality: existence and non-existence. These are two aspects of the world. That's why it's called a duality: existence and its equal and opposite, non-existence. That's this is an example of duality. Here's another example of duality: tall and short. Tall is the equal and opposite of short, and short is the equal and opposite of tall. Since there's two of them, that's why it's called a duality. Dual opposites. And tall and short can only exist together because something can only be tall relative to something that's short. And something can only be short relative to something that's tall. I'll continue with the examples. For example, large and small. Large is the equal and opposite of small, right? And something can only be large relative to something that's small, right? Past and future are equal and opposites. You can only be in the past relative to the future. And you can only be in the future relative to the past. Movement and non-movement are equal and opposites as well. And they exist simultaneously as one. And they must exist together. You can't have one without the other. Because you can only be moving relative to something that's not moving. And you can only be not moving relative to something that's moving. Only when you know that something isn't moving will you know that you're not moving. Fast and slow are also equal and opposites. You only know that you're moving fast when you see something that's moving slower than you. You only know that you're moving when you see something that's not moving. That's how this world works. And it's the same thing with existence as well. You only know you exist relative to something that doesn't exist. And you only know you don't exist relative to something that exists. So existence is not an objective, unilateral or universal trait. It's not a universal trait. You can only exist relative to something, and you can only not exist relative to something. It's not it's not just a universal trait, just like movement. You can only be moving relative to something that's not moving. Without something that's capable of moving, right? The word, non-movement no longer makes any logical sense. When everything moves, nothing will be moving because there's no such thing as non-movement. If there's no such thing as non-movement, the word movement no longer makes any logical sense. If there's no such thing as height, if there's no such thing as small, there's no such thing as large either. If there's no such thing as short, there's no such thing as tall. If there's no such thing as the past, the future will not exist. When everything is in the future, nothing will be in the future. Means the future and the past must exist. If everything is in the future, nothing will be in the future. Just like if everything in this world is tall, nothing in this world will be tall. If everything in this world is short, nothing in this world will be short. If everything in this world is human, nothing in this world will be human. If everything in this world are atoms, nothing in this world will be atoms. And I'll use atoms as an example, right? Because when it comes to God, many people believe that God doesn't exist. And it's a fact. Because everything in this world is God. That's why God has ceased to exist. When everything in this world is tall, tall will cease to exist. If everything is in the future will cease to exist. If everything doesn't move at all, the word movement, the very aspect of life, movement, will cease to exist. The moment you become everything, you cease to exist. So let's start with atoms. Let me give you an example of atoms. From our perspective, we don't see atoms anywhere, right? When you look at a tree, do you see atoms? No. You see the tree, right? When you look at your hands, your fingers, do you see atoms? No. You see your fingers. When you look around you at the world, do you see atoms? No. You see the world. Do you know why you don't see atoms but the world? It's because everything you see are atoms. When everything in this world are atoms, nothing will be atoms. That's why you don't see atoms anywhere. The moment atoms become every single thing in this world, it'll cease to exist. The only reason why we know atoms are atoms, right, is because there's something that isn't atoms. There's empty space that isn't atoms. That's the only reason why we know atoms are atoms. Atoms are the closest thing to non-existence because they fill the world around us. They're the vast majority of the world around us. Matter is the vast majority of the world around us. Energy are the vast majority, makes up the world around us. And the closer atoms get to be taking over the world, the closer atoms become non-existence. The moment atoms truly become everything, they will cease to exist. Why? Existence is relative. If you don't see something, right, it can't exist in your world. For example, if someone lives in Africa, right, never knew you, right? That person lived his entire life from day one till the day they die. If they never knew you, in their life, you don't exist. You never did. Why? Because they never knew you. If you can't interact with something, you can't see it. You have no way to interact with it in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't exist in your world. Existence and non-existence are relative. Relative to you, or relative to the person that's living in Africa right now, right? You don't exist. And likewise, relative to you, he doesn't exist. Why? Because you don't know them. The image you have of that person, if I mention the person right now, a man in Africa, you have an image of a man in your head, right? That image is not the real thing. The real person is still there. But because that person doesn't exist in your world, your mind is incapable of visualizing who that person is. You don't have an image in your mind of who that person is. The image you have is of another person. The very existence of that person does not appear in your head. You can't visualize something that doesn't exist. You just can't. As long as you've never seen that person before in your entire life, that person will never exist in your world. Existence is based off relativity. You will only exist relative to the people around you. If nobody knows you, if you're living in a cage, right? No, if you're living in a cave, you spent your entire life living in a cave, away from society, away from the rest of the world. To the rest of the world, you wouldn't exist. And to you, the entire world of humanity will never exist. Why? You've only spent time by yourself inside a cave. Once in a while, you go out to forage. Your mind doesn't, comprehend the existence of other people around you. You may think there are people around you, right? But their faces, their real faces, the clothes they wear, the cars they drive, whatever vehicle they drive, whatever things they do, you will not be able to visualize it because they don't exist in your world. When something doesn't exist, your mind is incapable of visualizing it. You can go online right now and search for a person in Africa. But the moment you search for a person in Africa and see an image, that's the first time they come into life in your world. Before then, your mind will be incapable of visualizing what they look like, what clothes they wear, whether they're even wearing clothes, whether they have tattoos, markings. You don't know any of this because they don't exist in your world. That's how relativity works. And that's how atoms work as well. Because atoms are everything that most humans know. Atoms do not exist. Almost everything that a human being sees are made up of atoms. Even the empty space in front of you, the thin air on planet Earth, right? The very atmosphere around us is still made up of atoms. Everything we know as a human being, almost everything except, space itself, outer space itself, are composed of atoms. That's why you don't see atoms anywhere. Because the moment you become everything, you cease to exist. There are many people right now who live their entire lives and who will live their entire lives without realizing that atoms exist. Why? Because if they don't see them, because atoms are everything, that's why you don't see atoms. You see what atoms create, but you don't see atoms themselves. That's how God works as well. Because God is everything. That's why you never see God. The only reason why you know what an atom is, because you know what an atom is not. Because you know there's something as empty space. Because you know there's such a thing as human, such a thing as photons, protons, neutrons, and electrons. You know there's such a thing as an atom. The only reason why you know an atom is because you know something that isn't an atom. You can only exist relative to something else. The moment you're the only thing that exists, the moment you become the only thing that exists, the moment you become everything, you cease to exist. Why? There's no reference point. What do you exist relative to what? You only know an atom exists because you know there are things in this world that aren't atoms. That's the only reason why you know atoms exist. The only reason why you call yourself a human is because you know there are things that aren't humans. They're trees, plants, animals, rocks, planets, stars. Because there are other things that aren't human. That's why you know you're a human being. Because you're different from them. The only reason why you think you're alive is because you know there are things that aren't alive. Rocks, Rocks do not behave like you do. Trees do not behave like you do. But trees also behave similarly. But rocks do not behave like you do. The sun does not behave like you do. The moon does not behave like you do. A diamond does not behave like you do. Right? Because of these things, that's why you believe you're alive and they're not. You can only be alive relative to something else. Why? Because the moment everything becomes alive, nothing is alive. There's no longer a point of reference that's outside of it. And if there's nothing outside of it, it can't exist. Existence is an illusion, just like non-existence. Without a reference point outside of you, you don't exist. And because God is everything, that's why God is nothing. Because the moment you become everything, you cease to exist. And it's not that you truly don't exist, it's that there's no reference point for our minds to be, to comprehend who you are. We're incapable of comprehending you without a reference point outside of you. So the moment you become everything, it is very hard for us to comprehend who you are. Do you exist? Do you not exist? Nobody knows. Because you can only exist relative to something that doesn't exist. You can only exist relative to something else. You can only be on the left relative to something that's on the right. You can only be on the right relative to something that's on the left. You can only be on the ground relative to something in the sky. You can only be in the sky relative to something on the ground. You can only be alive relative to something that's not alive. And you can only exist relative to something that doesn't exist. So when someone tells you that God doesn't exist, it's fact, but it's also wrong. God exists, but because God is everything, that's why you don't see God anywhere. The only reason why atoms exist is because atoms truly aren't everything. But atoms are very close because they're very close to almost being everything. That's why we don't see them anywhere right now. All you see, you look at your hands, you don't see atoms. You see your hand. When you look at the ground beneath you, you don't see atoms. You see the ground. When you see water, when you drink, a glass of water, you don't see yourself drinking a glass of atoms. You see yourself drinking a glass of water. The moment you become everything, you cease to exist. You blend into the background. Our minds will no longer be capable of understanding your existence because our minds only work through relativity. You can only exist relative to something. The moment you become everything, you will cease to exist. The word existence can no longer be used to describe you. And when it can no longer be used to describe you, you no longer exist. Because you can only exist relative to something. You can only be real relative to something. And that's the problem with God. That's why atheists will never believe in God. Is because they're incapable of realizing that because God is omnipresent, that's why you don't see God anywhere. It's just how this world of duality works. The moment you become omnipresent, you cease to exist. The moment you become omnipresent, nobody will be able to describe who you are because you can only exist relative to something. You can't just exist. You can only exist relative to something. The moment you become everything, the words existence and non-existence no longer apply. They don't apply to you. They don't apply to God. God is everything. Because God is everything, when you look around you at the sky, you don't see God, you see the sky. When you look at your fingers, you don't see God, you see your fingers. When you look at the tree, you don't see God, you see a tree. The moment you become everything, that's the moment you become absolutely nothing. So that's it for today's podcast episode. I pray for everyone's safety and understanding. Amen.